Hi, I'm Chance,
And I'm Sarah Catherine,
and this is Conservation Connection.
presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
We run a wildlife education nonprofit focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day around the country.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their career,
Their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field.
and everything in between.
Join us each week to discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet. Today, we're talking with Dr. Gorka Sancho. He's a fish ecologist, and he's a professor of biology here at College of Charleston.
Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so happy for you to be here today on this beautiful day in Charleston. Could you tell us just a little bit about how you got into this field of fish ecology?
I was one of those kids that went to a fishing tournament or visited New England Aquarium one too many times, and I still have books of myself coloring fishes and marking the fishes I've seen over my life. So
Wow.
I think at age 7, I became a fish biologist, and I never diverged since.
That's awesome.
I love it. Do you have a favorite fish? Starting off with that.
Ooh, too many to list.
I knew this was going to be a good question.
Yeah.
Trouts. I like trout
Okay.
just because it's the fish that I liked catching when I was a very young kid.
One of those things that kind of brought you in at an early age.
Exactly. And at some point in my career, I had the option of actually pursuing graduate studies in trout. And
Yeah.
I decided
Oh, wow.
against it. I grew up in Madrid in the inland of Spain. And the marine fishes were always a lot more exotic. So at some point I had the choice, like, no, I'll keep trout fishing as a hobby and I'll move into coral reef fishes for a profession. And since then, I've moved on to many other types of fishes.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, what exactly brought you here to Charleston? You said you were from Spain, right?
Originally from Spain, but I studied in the United States. I did my PhD here, but I was at the time working in Spain doing only research. And I actually tremendously missed education and teaching. So a job occurred in College of Charleston that sort of had my name written over it. Coincided with me having a son, and we decided to move back to the United States to be able to combine education and research, which are both passions of mine.
Yeah.
And I can't live one without the other one. So
I mean, I completely agree with that. I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin. It doesn't help to go out and build new information and learn new things about the environment if you're not also sharing that information with people and educating people about that. So we definitely understand that for sure.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that, what is some of the research you've done, either that you're doing right now or that you've done recently?
Most recently, I've been working on microplastics. As you know, it's been a major problem in ocean conservation, and the rate of microplastic accumulation in the oceans is increasing exponentially. And I had worked a lot on diets of fishes in different places, and we started noticing a long time ago that plastics are starting to show up in stomach contents and plankton samples, etc., and it's becoming a little bit of a problem. Other scientists in the Charleston community have been characterizing the amount and loads of microplastics in Charleston Harbor as a representative of an urban estuary of the East Coast of the United States. And I recently entered the fray looking at which are the species of fishes in Charleston Harbor that are most exposed to microplastics. So looking at different species, some are feeding off the bottom, some feeding midwater, and predators. And we're trying to see who has more microplastic and what type of microplastics are being accumulating in the guts of different fishes.
So is the idea that where a fish feeds or where it spends its life is going to change the amount of microplastics that it eats over its lifetime?
Yes. Now, we do not know over the lifetime. We are going to estimate that based on ingestion because fish eat microplastics, but the same as we do, it seems like they move through the digestive tract. So they come in and they go out. But it seems some recent research looks at very, very small microplastics called nanoplastics seem to be absorbed by the body through the digestive tract.
Okay.
We are not looking at those yet. Those are very tricky to look because they're really small. But the microplastics, we're looking at things that are as large as your fingernail going down to plankton size, very small. You can look with a small dissecting scope, but things that you can barely see with your eyes. And we are finding so far many of them, a lot of fibers, things that we wear, and a little degraded pieces of plastic bags and other plastics that you find in normal day to use.
Just single-use plastics.
Mostly, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, when did you start this research project, this specific one?
We started a year and a half ago. It's
Okay.
a brand new project. We've collected a lot of samples, and right now, if you were to walk in my lab, it's full of digesting fishes and very stinky place where I have a couple students that are constantly processing these plastics, and we're filtering them and then looking them on a microscope in order to quantify and identify.
Sounds like a great and stinky time.
Well, science can be very stinky.
How long would you expect for this kind of research to take? When do you expect for it to be done and published?
We started a year and a half ago with the concept of the project, getting some funding for it and getting some preliminary data and preliminary samples. We are done collecting the samples at the present time, so we're in the grunt work of processing the stomachs and starting to finalize the quantification methods of the plastic. So I have a couple students that are spending way too long looking at a microscope.
Yeah.
But we are expecting to be done by the end of the summer and the publication occur within a year since then. So the whole
Okay.
thing from beginning of the idea to publication, 3 years, 3.5 years.
And is that pretty standard for the field of marine ecology and vertebrate marine ecology?
I would say yes to get that preliminary paper. Now, this is a project that started from scratch in my case. If you're continuing ongoing research, that could be a lot shorter. But basically, you're building upon previous data that you have.
Right.
So in other projects, I can have a publication follow the previous one in a year. But in this case, 3 years from beginning to end is a pretty good estimate.
I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier, that you've got students staring in microscopes, looking at bits of plastic. Are you guys doing work to identify where these plastics came from? Are there any surprising findings of what is creating microplastics?
So the traditional ones, the whole oceans right now are full of different mixes of plastics. They're mostly fibers that come mostly from clothing, original pellets, which is the base form as plastics are formed. And if I want to make credit cards, I buy bales of pellets that I can melt and make into whatever I want. You
Okay.
can find some of those. And then what we're finding a lot is small pieces of degraded plastic. So a plastic bag or something like that that's left in the ocean is a plastic bag. But over time, bacteria and UV light are going to start degrading it into smaller pieces. So
Okay.
these are degraded small plastics. You find always a mix of those three in different concentrations, and it varies a little bit. We also finding in urban systems that are near roads a lot of chopped tires. That to me was new. It's basically as your normal car tire degrades and you eventually have to change a tire, you wonder like, where did all this tire go? You know, I bought a
Right.
new one and after a few years I have a bold tire. Well, all that tire broke down into small pieces.
Right.
Equivalent to what you find in artificial soccer field, for example. You find those little bits of
Yeah,
tires.
yeah.
So those we're finding lots of them underneath highway passes. So whenever there's a highway pass going over a marsh or a river, right around it, you find a lot of these rubber tires.
Wow. I didn't even really think of that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's the consequences of our everyday life and choices, especially here in North America. You have to have a car to get places. We don't have a ton of great public transport. And the consequences of that are more than just the gas that we're burning and the fossil fuels you're putting out, but what happens as the car just wears and tears and the bits that kind of fall off, and where do those go? Because they don't just magically disappear into nothingness. They have to go somewhere. So it's really interesting that you're finding lots of those rubber pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we said that the plastics a lot of the times in the fish will pass through them if they're not at the nano scale. Why does it matter the amount of plastic that one type of fish versus another type of fish is ingesting? Are there other health issues that come with plastic ingestion like that?
It's hardly debated, not hardly debated, but it's part of science that right now we're figuring out what are the effects, because these plastics are degraded. They have communities of bacteria growing on them. It's not your typical clean plastic when you buy a
Right.
brand new bag. These bags have been in the water for a lot. We talk about the plastosphere, which is the community of bacteria that are growing on the plastics.
Okay.
And a lot of these bacteria could be harmful health-wise. And then also degraded plastics tend to accumulate a lot of heavy metals. So, for example, mercury tends to stick to plastic in many different ways. So by just ingesting a plastic, it could have a lot of heavy metals attached to it. So what are the health consequences of microplastics? The jury's still out, but there's a lot of research going on it, especially since it seems like our drinking water from the faucet has microplastics.
Right.
And we are drinking certain amounts of microplastics, small amounts at the time being, but only are going to be increasing. And it's very hard to filter them out in a cost-effective way. So there's a lot of interest in seeing this. Now, we are looking at trying to identify which are the fishes that accumulate more microplastics or are more exposed to them, both to see if it has harmful effects to the fishes, but also trying to figure out where are these microplastics going within the food chain, because they're in the water. We know, for example, oysters and mussels filter them, but barnacles do not. Barnacles are good enough to, like, say no to microplastics and only eat edible particles, but mussels sort of just filter everything and accumulate them in their tissue. So we're interested to see which fishes are the ones that are ingesting more and are being more exposed to these microplastics. So it's a preliminary research. From there on, we'll move to do more elaborate things to see what's the retention time, what type of microplastics might have deleterious effects on fishes. But right now, we're trying to figure out who's eating them and who's being more exposed and who's of less concern because they're not eating them as often.
I'm kind of curious to ask, I really think that more people are noticing that plastics are a huge issue, and there's changes you can make, like using a reusable bag, a metal straw or something, finding ways around using plastics. But in regards to the tire, like you mentioned, what are things, if there's anything, what can we do to avoid stuff like that?
I think in a lot of road design, this was never thought of.
Of course.
In roads that are middle of nowhere, there's nothing to be done, and there is a lot of road particle in normal roads. Now, when doing an overpass over a river or over an estuary, you could design basically what happens when it rains, where do all that rainwater end up? And you could collect all these pieces of road tire and prevent them from entering the aquatic ecosystem. At the present time, at least here in Charleston, this was never thought of, and basically the drainage from these roads goes directly into the estuary. It never really thought about the potential of tire particles end up in the estuary. Now this is known, hopefully we can reshape the roads and redesign them in order to collect all this water and have it go to some collector so we can filter out the road particles. And I don't know, probably distribute them back onto the soccer fields or somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if you're a civil engineer, I guess, or somebody.
Or materials engineer.
Yeah, listen up and make that difference. Go and make that change. Design us some new roads.
And that's one of those things that it just kind of goes to show that everything in science is connected to everything else. You know, we've got a fish ecologist whose world kind of revolves around how fish behave and what they're eating and how they're interacting with their environment, that is having to think about, okay, maybe if we work with somebody who redesigns the roads, which is a completely different field, or somebody who redesigns the tires, they don't degrade the same way. This is how we solve the problem. So it's that kind of interdisciplinary science that really resolves problems, and that's a fun conversation to have. Now, you do a lot more work than just looking at microplastics, right? There's a lot more research that's coming out of your lab, and you work with one of my favorite marine organisms, tiger sharks. So what does your lab do with tiger sharks?
So, as you said, tiger sharks are a top-end predator, really emblematic, and I always get a lot of graduate students that want to work with tiger sharks, etc. And we had a few years ago a local charter captain contact us and tell us what's going on with these large adult tiger sharks that we're capturing in the estuaries. And we were surprised because we did not know. I collaborate with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and we didn't know that there were these large tiger sharks. And we went with him, and he showed it to us, and we're like, wow, yeah, there's some pretty large adult tiger sharks.
I see that now, yeah.
In the South Carolina estuaries. So we started a new sampling program to try to confirm their presence, figure out what are they doing here and when are they here. And that evolved into a long-term project of looking at the natural history and behavior of tiger sharks in South Carolina waters. It seems like during the spring months, many tiger sharks, juveniles and large adults, come into coastal waters. And it seems like they probably are feeding on small sharks or horseshoe crabs that come here for mating. During the summer months, certain individuals stay and spend all summer long in South Carolina estuaries, while others will go and migrate up towards New England and other more northern waters. And then in the fall, we get a big event of having large tiger sharks show up in our estuaries again. It seems like in this case it's related to mating.
Okay.
We found some very large females with big mating wounds from males. And then usually by November comes around, they leave South Carolina waters. It gets a little bit too cold for them.
Okay.
And they leave to more tropical waters, typically down to Florida and Bahamas.
Okay. And now you said they're kind of hanging around in estuaries. That's not too typical for them, is it?
No, typically tiger sharks are well known to occupy offshore waters and coastal waters, but we have a few estuaries in Southern Carolina that are high salinity estuaries. So they are an estuary. They look like a normal estuary, but if you actually measure, the salinity is not that low, like in a typical estuary.
So it's a lot closer to ocean water than fresh water.
It's closer to ocean water, but you're in shallow waters with beaches nearby and very coastal environment.
So
Yeah.
give me a sense of scale here. When we say large adult tiger shark, about how big are we talking?
1,500 pounds, 14 feet long,
Wow.
And how deep is the water that they're being found in?
20 feet, 15 feet.
Jeez. In my undergrad, I did some work here in Kiowa looking at diamondback terrapins, and we spent days dragging nets through estuaries of South Carolina, catching diamondback terrapins in there. And I'm thinking back now that maybe I should have been looking for tiger sharks.
The reality is they are very abundant and they're very close to shore, but we have no harmful interactions with humans.
Yeah.
In the sense that there's a large surfing community. I surf, my kids surf, and I basically don't tell them, don't worry about it. Our waters are not very transparent, so it's not like you can see anything underwater.
Right.
But we haven't had a shark attack of any consequence in South Carolina for almost a century. There's been no consequent deaths. And in principle, common knowledge should say you should not swim with large sharks when the water visibility is low. But since the water visibility is always low in South Carolina, there's nothing that you can do about it. And
Right.
it doesn't seem to be a problem.
I have a special soft spot in my heart for sharks. I think that they are one of those animals that's really charismatic, and everybody knows what a shark is. And you think the ocean, you think sharks. And they're so misunderstood. They're considered this unthinking eating machine that sees a human, goes, awesome, lunch is here. And that's really not the case. And I really love the fact that you're spending a significant amount of your career looking at a very large, quote unquote, man-eater shark that really likes to predate on humans, and they don't. Even when they're right near beaches in shallow water, in water that's not very clear, it's very easy to be mistaken for another food source. And you're saying that there hasn't been any sort of interaction of consequence between humans and tiger sharks in almost a century, and that's pretty incredible.
There's been no mortalities in South Carolina for over 100 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that's a little snippet of information that more people should know. I have friends that don't like swimming in the ocean because they're afraid that every time they get in, a shark's going to get them. And showing that not only are they here, but they're here kind of abundantly, and there's no negative interactions with people for the most part. That's a pretty cool thing to document.
Absolutely. I mean, we are not part of the public education, but it's more of the discovery that bringing to attention of people that there's all these tiger sharks, and there is actually developing fisheries for a lot of these large sharks now. Their numbers are rebounding, and sharks are actually doing much better than they were 20 or 30 years ago.
Wow.
Fishing of sharks seems to have decreased. There's a lot of federal and state protections for them.
Right.
And the population of sharks are definitely on the rebound and increasing in South Carolina.
Well, I think it's great that, like you said, you have a bunch of students that come in and they're like, oh, wow, I want to work with these sharks. And I think we're really seeing that more in general, just like we're seeing people caring more about pollution and finding alternatives to plastic. I feel like we're seeing more and more people saying, oh, sharks are cool. Like, they don't want to eat me. I feel like that kind of stigma is changing and shifting a little, which is great.
Now, my next question. How do you track a 1,500-pound, 14-foot-long tiger shark in waters where you can't see more than 5 feet?
We use different technologies to do this. Very interestingly, sharks are very easy to work with. It sounds counterintuitive. Once you capture one, you bring it to the side of the boat. If you flip it upside down, they go into what we call tonic immobility, which basically means they stop fighting, they start doing anything, and we can do surgery on them. We can attach different instruments to them, and they're very easy to work with. So we use both satellite technology, which we put certain tags that whenever the shark comes up to the surface and the dorsal fin breaks the surface, it'll transmit its position to a satellite, and we can look at it real time. That technology has not been so successful in South Carolina because they're in very coastal waters with a lot of nutrients, and there's a lot of biological fouling and growth on these tags, so we can't keep the barnacles from growing from our tags. So the majority of our data we're getting is using acoustic tags. This is a different technology. In this case, we implant a little transmitter inside the shark. We do a little surgery and put it inside its abdominal cavity, and then this tag, for a period of up to 9 years, will basically be making an acoustic unique signal.
Wow.
And when the shark swims by a receiver, and we have large nets of receiver around South Carolina, and other scientists have it all up and down the East Coast. When the shark swims by a receiver, the receiver will record this tag. It has a unique number, so we'll know when the shark was nearby a receiver.
So we're using audio signals. Is it within human hearing range, or is it not something that you would hear?
No, you cannot hear the much higher hearing range. You can put a tag to your skull, and you can barely hear something, which is how you check that it's actually working and on. But no, you cannot hear anything.
And what's the range on this? How close to a receiver does a shark need to swim?
In beautiful blue water, the manufacturer tells us 400 to 500 meters, but in murky, sediment-filled estuarine waters, 50 to 100 meters.
Okay.
So big difference there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was a surprise that there were large tiger sharks coming all the way into the estuaries here in South Carolina. Would you be able to estimate the size of the population? Are we talking about a couple dozen sharks a year? Are we talking about several hundred?
We've tagged close to 50 so far.
Okay.
And we can tag many more if we increase our effort. We are close to have some estimations of our populations, but the reality is also these sharks are highly mobile. And there's many sharks that come and visit South Carolina, and then we never see again until 3 or 4 more years. But these sharks probably are joining offshore populations and swimming all the way to Bermuda or into the middle of the Atlantic for a couple of years and then coming back. We've noticed that there is a lot of exchange between shark populations. They can cross an Atlantic within a year and a few months, etc. So when they want to move, they can. So it's very hard to get a total estimate for the shark populations in the Atlantic.
So you get a seasonal increase in the number of sharks that you're finding pretty consistently. You're saying that in fall and in spring, you're finding lots of these sharks, but not so much during winter. Basically, the question I think I'm asking is, how predictable is their movement pattern?
So it is predictable and unpredictable. Let's explain it. Certain sharks seem to prefer to spend most of the time in South Carolina waters. We call them sort of residents. And they tend to like a specific site, and they will spend there 9 months of the year in that single site. Do they do this every year? Not always. They might do this for 2 or 3 years, and then on the 4th year, they might disappear. We have other sharks that visit South Carolina waters and then move on and keep on moving up the coast mostly. So we call those transient ones. They visit every year, but they don't spend too much time.
Right.
And then we have some sharks that we detect every once in a while. They come visit South Carolina, and then we don't know exactly where they go. And many years later, they'll come back. So there's a lot of variability of the behavior. We seem to be finding that every spring, we get almost like about 60 or 70% of all the tiger sharks that we tagged will show up in South Carolina waters.
Wow.
And that's when we're talking about sort of a shark aggregation. But many of the coastal Atlantic population of tiger sharks will show up in South Carolina in the spring months. And that's where we believe it's probably related to feeding, most likely in horseshoe crab spawning. That coincides when the horseshoe crabs spawn in South Carolina waters and the sharks show up. And we've done some isotope work, which basically is a way of telling by taking tissue samples out of shark what has it been eating. And it seems like most of our tiger sharks have been heavily feeding on crustaceans, crabs. And crabs are bottom organisms, and turns out that in April, May is when the horseshoe crabs are in South Carolina mating. So probably feeding on horseshoe crabs.
It's pretty cool to be able to answer questions on that mystery of what are these sharks eating? Why do we have all of these sharks showing up at the same time? And be able to trace it down at a molecular level to be like, oh, yeah, horseshoe crabs, same time.
Yeah, absolutely. This can't be the easiest thing. I mean, you have to go out, you have to find a shark, you have to catch the shark, you have to put some kind of tracker on it. Have y'all faced any challenges really along the way as you've been studying these sharks?
Challenges is to capture sharks during the summer months. During the summer months is when we have most free time. It's available, the weather's best, and we know there's quite a few tiger sharks in summer months, but we can't capture any tiger sharks in the summer months because we can't keep other shark species from biting our hooks. So in the summer months, we put our hooks, but we'll catch lemon sharks, hammerheads, sandbars, black tips, and we can't keep all this bycatch off our hooks.
Right.
While we have usually tiger sharks, or the large sharks that visit South Carolina are the first ones to show up and among the last ones to leave. So we have two big openings at the beginning and the end of the season where we can capture them well. But in the middle of the summer, it's very hard to capture a tiger shark without capturing 20 other sharks before you capture a tiger shark.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. If you had one snippet of advice, one piece of advice that you could give to a student or a high schooler that's interested in maybe following in your footsteps and pursuing a career in fish ecology, what advice would you give them?
Be passionate about what you want to do. Being a marine biologist is a dream that many students have, and few follow through. There's a lot of challenges along the way. But if you're really passionate about what you want to study and what you want to do in life, you can achieve it if you keep on working hard. And not everyone's going to become a marine biologist. So we have at the College of Charleston a lot of great students that go on to become marine biologists, but they've been working hard at it since they came here. They continue through their careers, jumping hoops and avoiding pitfalls, and eventually make it. Now, if you're not passionate about what you want to do, it will be very hard to fulfill your dreams.
Yeah, it seems like passion and follow through kind of go hand in hand. If it's something you're passionate about, you're willing to keep running into those hurdles and figuring out a way around them. And that passion is what can kind of carry you through that.
Absolutely.
Well, we have had a great time chatting with you. Thank you so much for taking time to be here with us today.
Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We would love to hear from you. If you want to reach out to us, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
If you're a teacher and you'd like to use this episode in your classroom, get in touch with us.
We'll provide you with state and national standard tie-ins and additional materials to help you guide a class discussion.
Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week.